Welcome to KDH Collective's Neuropod, a journey where we delve into the intricate world of neurodivergence within the therapy room. Join Katie Holmes, a licensed professional counselor with 16 years of experience, and Erica Thibodeau, a seasoned licensed professional clinical counselor, as they wholeheartedly share their extensive expertise, personal encounters, and therapeutic insight. Our aim is to foster greater understanding and appreciation for this remarkable population. Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about sensory profiles and the spectrum of sensory needs that we see in neurodiverse patients and clients. I'll just jump in with my first introduction so we can save time. Into this is getting trained in the Play Project, which is an early intervention for autism. And we just took each child through basically a questionnaire, working with their family to figure out how do they experience the world through their senses, and where does that experiencing become a symptom that stops them from functioning, or becomes a symptom basically, or a behavior that is interfering with their life, or I don't want to make it only pathological, because sometimes it's just about comfort, sometimes it's about soothing themselves. And so basically they looked at how they like auditory processing, proprioception. So did they need to move, rock, swing, jump? Where was their body in space? Some others, let me think. Olfactory, smell, did they avoid smells? Did they go through the world seeking smells? Vestibular, with hearing, basically their balance, movement, touching. I had a child who like licked their way through the world, really experienced the world through taste. What comes to mind for you, Keisha, with this?
Well, just when you started talking about it, it's like difference. I look at it like a spectrum. You know me, my black and white brain. So like a spectrum, on one end is difference, and on the other end is disability or dysfunction or whatever you want to call it, right? And there's all these points in between. So sometimes it's just a difference. It's just a preference for how we live. And sometimes if you have this intense sound sensitivity, it becomes like assaulting to your nervous system and will actually create symptoms of depression and anxiety. And so then we get into dysfunction or disability or whatever you want to call that, but just that line of difference. And I think as therapists, it's our job to help. Our role is, when people are struggling, to figure out how these differences might be contributing to their mental health and whatever they're coming to us for. And then how do we help them? We're not there to just be like, oh, okay, it's a difference. Great. Let's move on. Right. If it is creating dysfunction, we are going to want to help them with that.
Yes. And I think that this is because the spectrum is so broad and wide. We have the range, in the range of dysfunction is avoidance and seeking. That there's a spectrum within a spectrum inside of that range. And so I think that it can really be helpful to tell the story. So if we're talking about adults, and adults who may or may not already have a diagnosis of neurodivergence, but you're noticing patterns in their avoidance or in their behavior, maybe their risky behavior, or you're just noticing patterns, that there's a deeper story, and it might be a sensory story. And actually, you really helped me personally notice some things. One of the biggest things is that I would have one of the hardest times of my day was after driving home with kids in the car. And you were like, Erica, it's overwhelm. I really think it's overwhelm. I think it's overwhelm. I think it's sensory overwhelm. And I was like, wow, once I noticed what was happening in my body in the car, and it would be like an audiobook on with the kids, construction, I'm processing the day, all these like sounds, so many sounds actually splitting my attention. And what I really noticed was repetitive sounds from one of my kids, and it would just like ramp me up, ramp me up, ramp me up. And so I started doing this thing where Everyone gets out of the car. I take a few minutes, go inside. Because what would happen is like we'd all melt down like right the minute we got in the door, which is a really common neurodiverse behavior. It's a human behavior, but it can get really intense with people who are overstimulated with certain sensory overwhelm.
And I want to add to that. And I think that part of like what plays into this is a good parent does XYZ, right? So you get in the
Yes.
car, you have this sensory sensitivity, but you're like, I got to listen to my kids, right? And
Right.
I even know when my nieces and nephews are in my car, I'm like, please turn off the devices. Like it makes me crazy. That's on, the radio's on, somebody's talking to me, another person's screaming in the back. It's a lot. And that's not to mention what I'm visually picking up as I drive. And so I think those, I want to say it's like vying for attention or like values driven kind of behaviors. A good parent, a good caregiver listens to their kids. It will override what is best for our nervous system because we want to be there, right? And we don't even think of how it's affecting us because we want to be there for the kids, right? That's most important. It like becomes an absolute. And so I think, when you're trying to pick this stuff apart, sometimes it does take an outside person to be objectively like looking at it, like I did with you. Like, what could this be, right? And it definitely was the sound thing. So I use this
It was
example.
the sound, yes. And the splitting of attention of like kind of the visual stuff too. Like you're looking, but then there's a repetitive sound happening. And the day after we talked about it, I just observed in the car and my son was like clicking a pin like over and over and over. And I was like, oh my gosh, I really like with every click, it was like mounting and mounting and mounting, but I was like, I am not going to say a word. But I mean, it was just like a little trial. Like it was just a little observation.
Mhm.
Smells, there's so many things, but some people move towards these things. Like there's such a stimulating experience in the body with these sensory experiences. And I think when I take someone through a sensory profile sort of curiosity or questionnaire, sometimes it's a formal questionnaire, sometimes it's curiosity. Some things they'll seek and some things they'll avoid. So it's never even like one type of profile per person.
Well, and no, so I am sensory seeking. I can't have repetitive stuff. But when I get in my car, the music is so loud. Like when my guy gets in the car, he's like, like, Keisha, turn it down. Like it is blaring and I like 150 beats per minute. So it's like, boom, 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 boom. I mean, it is intense in my car and I'm jamming out. And I could do that almost every time I get in the car. But you put a bunch of different noises, it's too much. It's kind of fascinating how the
Well, yes, Keisha. And it's interesting because of our long history together. So I will say this. I notice with teens that tend to be more ADHD type symptoms and behaviors, they
yeah.
will like get like their big headphones on with like blasting music and like goes on the swing set like as fast as can be. Or like one of them that I knew, mom was the client and I was really helping her, like, I think your son needs an assessment. He would like rock with his like music blasting. He would like in his rocking chair that was like the rocking chair that she had like rocked him in as a baby. And that's interesting because it's like an overwhelm of certain senses, right? I remember as a teen, young adult, being in the car with our friends, with you, and I'm like the one in the back seat who's like, like everyone else was enjoying how loud it was, and I was just like, like I couldn't take.
No, I remember, and Monet, it was Monique. Monique would
Yeah.
be singing and passing the microphone. It
Yes.
was a lot. It was a pretend microphone, but yeah, yeah.
Sensory differences. Well, and also, so one of the things, just for any clinicians listening, that I think is so often what can come up in relationships is just different sensory experiences, needs, requirements, comfort levels rubbing up against each other in a household or in a family.
I love that you say that because so we're talking about differences and maybe they're going into some sort of disability, but I think most of the people we work with are adults that are functioning, right? They're like in their life, they're struggling a little bit, but there are some people on the spectrum who this is like very intense. And it
Well,
becomes, in a family
yes.
where it's like the sounds are so assaulting to them that they scream. They might even break someone's arm.
Or
They
the
might
smells or the
hit someone.
chewing. Like
Yes.
if family dinners break down every day, maybe someone has a sensory experience that is like overriding. I have, one of the things that I think is important to remember is the more able someone is, the more they can mask and the more they can suppress. But what's happening at home when they're exhausted? They are tired of doing that all day. Do they have anything left for their personal life, for their family members, for their children if they're a parent? And that's where I really see it becoming dysfunctional, because if they're exhausted by the interruptions, the sounds in their office place, the fluorescent lights, the hum of electronics, because these are all things that will really come up in sessions. And a lot of people got a break during the pandemic if they did work at home in their own controlled environment. And then going back to work has been, I would say, a difficult couple of years for some people who were like, this is what I've always wanted. No social engagements and like complete control over my environment, but that it's turns out, we've all opened back up in the last couple of years. So it's interesting because I think the more functional someone might seem when they're coming in our door, if this is at play, it's like they can be really depleted from having to pretend or mask or suppress all the time.
And let's describe what masking is. I mean, I think most people know nowadays, but masking, how would you describe it? I describe it like this. It requires a lot of energy, a lot of energy. And not all people think it's a curse. Some of my clients think it's a gift that they can do this,
Yes, a
where
talent.
they can show up in a certain way. I mean, I do it. I'm hyperactive, but when I'm a therapist, I am not hyperactive with my clients. You might get moments where I like will be me, and just kind of like, or I'll laugh or whatever. But generally, it's like I'm very controlled. I'm
Yeah, you
like,
have like professional counselor Keisha.
yeah, I'm tracking my client, whatever they're showing up as, that's how I am. I feel like it's a very constricted way of being for me, but it's required for me to be successful at my job.
Yes.
And it does require a lot of energy. And so I think people on the spectrum, often they can be more social or they can do things like that aren't natural for them, but as a way of like coping and living in a world not made for them. They can
Yeah.
do these things and it does require more energy. It's not natural. It's not like a natural, authentic way of being.
Yes. Well, and I think that, the way I've heard, I described this, I think, in like our first episode, but someone in my office described it this way. It's like they have an operating system that requires a secondary operating system to interact with everyone else. So this whole human interaction thing they were not made quite for it. So they're having to run this like other program and it like slows everything down or it like exhausts the system because they're running out of steam to run two operating systems instead of just the one that's
And think
them.
Well, and think about racial differences. So then add to that maybe some racial
Yes.
differences that come in. I
Yes.
mean, then that's a third operating system.
Cultural differences, even like
Yeah.
gender expectations. Absolutely. There's so many conditioned like systems I think placed on people. And then, already we know that in these systems people are switching like what you just described. You switch into this different, code switching into this different you at work. And I think that a lot of people are exhausted by that, whether they have a diagnosis of any type of neurodivergence or not. But it's particularly taxing when several systems don't work right for the person. They have to mask in several different situations or environments, or when home is not
Ugh,
easy.
yeah. Add that to it, man.
Because I will say, working with family members of people who are living with who are neurodivergent, the home is like the safe place, and then home is where they kind of let it all out, and I would call it melting down. So they come home and there's a meltdown, and I hear it from parents of teenagers a lot, like they're fine at school, they're wonderful, blah, 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 all the stuff. And then and you hear it when they're younger, right? We hear this in like toddler age and everyone's like it's normal. But then when they're doing it at 13 or 14 or 17 and the meltdowns are really big, or they're an adult and the meltdowns are really big and all they can do is like go off in a room and be like completely quiet in the dark, it can really weigh on their relationships, you know.
Well, and I was thinking, as you said, meltdown. So there's like that hyper where people might scream or be more expressive. And then there's the hypo, which is what I see more of, that shutdown, where it's like the nervous system. And sometimes, it can be bothersome for families. And other times people think they're fine. They're like, but they're not.
Totally.
Yeah, they seem okay. They just take a lot of time by themselves. Well, that's because they're shut down. They're literally like in their room, like steam coming off their head, like just trying to recover from the day.
And more verbal interaction is just exhausting. And especially if they're a parent or they have a spouse who, sometimes I'll see this like someone who works in a problem solving field, they're solving problems all day long. Their spouse perhaps doesn't work outside the home or needs more social interaction. That person comes home zapped. The spouse is just like ripe and ready for connection. There is a whole missed like rhythm. Like they're not able to connect and join and plug into each other. And that can be really stressful and hard.
Which is it's making sense what you're talking about. It's like this idea that these sensory, how we receive stimulus or information, stimuli from the environment, how our body actually receives it, and how it gets excited or recovers from it affects how we show up in our relationships. Man, we're going to do a deeper dive on each of these, but I think the general theme here is that some people can be sensory seeking, some people can be sensory avoidant, and we can be both in the same body. And because
often are, yes.
Yeah, because of these differences, I think it makes it. Oh, you hear that sneezing in my next room, my office mate?
Some background ambiance.
Yeah, just a little bit. But it can affect how people are showing up in their relationships and what we're seeing in our office, right? I even think it affects how people cope, right? Like effective coping is rooted in these differences and understanding this on a much deeper level than I think we normally do as therapists.
Yes.
Because think,
yes.
When you discovered the sound thing, how much therapy had you had up until that point? When we just
years, lifetime, not even kidding. 5 years old on. I mean, never given a neurodivergent diagnosis because I coped through chemicals until I got sober to turn it all off and to overstimulate my system too. Lots of stimulants and depressants.
Which makes sense. Yeah.
So this is another thing I'll hear sometimes. I've heard it from a few male clients. They're either on or off. Like they're either high intensity and their partner is complaining because they're too much. They feel like they're too much, right? And they're bothering their partner, they're an annoyance, or they're just like off and they're kind of numb and there's just like a shutdown. And it's hard, I've heard this actually three different people are coming to mind. It's just like hard to find that middle area where their spouse lives. And so they're on these ends swinging from end to end, and the spouse is like in this whole middle area, and they just like can't seem to overlap.
Well, and think about how we traditionally look at this pattern. We're looking at it through attachment styles. Avoidant attachment, anxious attachment. We're like, oh, he's ping-ponging between the two. He's I forgot what it's called. Is it disorganized when it's like two different ones, right?
Yep.
And it might be this, but really what's at the heart of it are these sensory differences. And if we could, I guess like a neurodivergent coping style would be like, how do we align y'all or get the person more aware of what they need at any given moment, whether they get it
Mm-hmm.
through stimuli, through like compression, like wristbands,
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
I
Noise
don't
canceling
know.
headphones.
Yeah. Yeah. So that it can align with their partner in a more intentional way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that all forms of therapy are bad. I just don't think they're the whole picture. Like probably
Absolutely. Because
these
I
attachments.
think
Yeah.
behavior change, it just really, if we're looking at just behavior change, if this person has some kind of behavior and it's been deemed a problem, and we look at just changing the behavior in their everyday life, it's not going to get at the thing that's actually happening underneath the behavior, underneath the experience that they're having. And so I think this is one more layer of looking at them as a whole person and saying, "Oh, you do that because," like, there was a family I worked with, and it dinner time was really, really awful. One of the parents had like a sensory issue. I can think it's called misophonia.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Basically with
yeah,
chewing, right? And
yeah.
so that parent would have like get really and they didn't connect that to the meltdown breakdown of dinner time. But
Mhm.
immediately when I heard that that was like, and I was doing in-home therapy back then, and I was like, heard about that, like dinner time is like the hardest time of day, and one person has this sensory issue. I was like, well, clearly, I'm sure something's happening connected to this experience that is throwing things into a more tense state, and it results in things falling apart at this time of day. And I love when families get really creative about like how to navigate it, and they break all the rules of like how we're supposed to do things. I love, love, love that. And I think, I don't know. I think there's like a balance of like increasing tolerance to the distress. I mean, it's up to the person. Do you want to increase your tolerance to this, or do you just need a different environment altogether? And what choice do you have here?
Well, and I will say, so the misophonia thing came up when I got trained for OCD, and they said people um, they never will adjust to that sound. You can learn to tolerate more and more distress, but the distress will not go down. You won't desensitize to it because
Mm,
it's frustration. You can learn to tolerate more and more of it. And I think, old school, that's what it was about, right? We're going to get you to tolerate more and more of it. But then say you're a teacher, you're at school all day. I'm just throwing this out there, and you got these sound like bombardments happening all day long, right? So it's too much. You come home, you have misophonia. It's too much of an ask. You're already at your top level of stress in your stress meter for the day because of the sensory differences or sensory sensitivities you have in your environment. So I think for me, it's so novel, this idea of like, why don't we find other creative ways? I love that. So we can meet the person where they're at and give them more tools. Me and you, I want to say this, we will go back and forth. Like when we started getting into trauma therapy a long time ago, we'd be like, oh, it's trauma. Trauma. I mean, trauma answered so much. And I feel like these sensory awarenesses are just as groundbreaking, at least for me
yes.
in private practice.
And how often is was a person abused because they were the only person in their family with a sensory issue and no one understood it? They were too small or didn't have the ability to articulate the problem. And I one more thing, just for any parents who have sensory seeking behaviors in their children, I have really noticed this difficult like a miss happens. The child seeks something because it stimulates them, and it's like a behavior that they've been corrected on a lot of times. And what I notice the miss is that when the family doesn't recognize that it's a stimulating experience, the feeling is so exciting they cannot stop, even if they're going to get in trouble, even if they're going to get like really in trouble. Like whatever the discipline is, like it is not big enough to stop the stimulating feeling that they like have to do the thing. And I'll see this with fire, animals. These are things that we traditionally put in a oppositional defiant disorder diagnosis, a conduct disorder diagnosis. And it has to do with a sensory feeling in the body, and they cannot stop, especially if the thing is something they're not supposed to do. And everyone is like on them, looking at them, paying attention. And we'll hear, you know, kind of old school, they're seeking attention. Yes, they are. There's a reason for it. They refuse to stop. And we get really freaked out with some of these behaviors, but really it's a sensory thing going on inside. And if the input comes in a healthier way, typically you can support the person in transitioning. But the family,
Well,
like, how often does this get missed? All the time. All the time.
because it's not, we look at it more like it's a choice. I mean, there's a lot of
Exactly.
things that we look at like it's a thought and it's a choice. And I think even down the trauma rabbit hole, like the more things we learn, this is like a reactionary response that happens inside of us. And maybe we can build our prefrontal cortex kind of awareness, but generally this is stuff we just do. And as adults, we should probably allow ourselves to do. Like when I get in the car, I need that sensory, I think you froze. I need that sensory experience. I think that these things are not reactionary. Like they are reactionary. These are natural things that occur in our body that we just do. And children specifically, right? As adults, we can think about these things and stop ourselves from doing these like sensory seeking, but they do produce certain feelings in us. So I loved flip-flops and like gymnastics and all that stuff when I was a kid, jumping on a trampoline. And even now, like I imagine myself doing like headstands and back bends. And these are things that like, even though they hurt my body, they feel good as well. And so I think there is something about those attention seeking behaviors or sensory seeking behaviors that actually gave my nervous system like good dopamine feelings. Actually, I'm going to start doing more of them. So we are out of time for today, and Erica got dropped, but we will cover more of this next time. We're going to go deeper dive into each sensory difference because I think it's at the core of treating most mental health and most humans, for us learning how to cope in the best, most effective way possible.